The Fantasy Animation Podcast is a completely independent production. It is made by experts in the field. Chris is a lecturer in liberal arts and visual cultures education at King's College London and author of The Computer Animated Film, available in all good bookshops. And I, Alex that is, am a senior lecturer in film and media studies at the University of Portsmouth and author of Encountering the Impossible, the fantastic in Hollywood fantasy cinema, available in even better bookshops. We do this podcast to provide audiences with an informative and hopefully entertaining guide through the ways in which you can not only enjoy fantasy and animation, but study it, examine it, explore it, and of course, make it and have a career in it. I hope you enjoy the show. Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. I'm Alex Sargent.
And I'm Chris Holliday.
Chris, it's our Halloween special, a spooky time of year as always, and we have a seasonal treat for our listeners in ParaNorman, the Leica horror, fantasy, stop motion. What else is it? Lots of other things that we'll play with. A movie I had not seen before, but very much enjoyed watching and did. I think when we spoke about it, you told me it's a bit like Monster House. It's a bit like some other that we've encountered on the thing. But I thought it was very rich and interesting film. So I'm excited to talk about it from lots of different angles. How about you?
Yes, I've got a really basic question about stop motion's relationship to horror and whether we can go beyond. Okay, stop motion's unusual and uncanny, and okay, so but what else is there?
Sure.
So I'm interested in talking about horror in relation to stop motion, of course, and also the use of CGI in stop motion films as an interesting proposition. So there's some kind of stuff written about stop motion films often have little moments where it's CG or it's digitally enhanced, and sort of how do we negotiate that different mixing of media and maybe how that kind of works in relation to horror. So I'll chuck in some stuff around also 3D colour printing as well, probably. Cool.
Always interested in talking about horror, and it's kind of as the kind of the wicked stepchild of fantasy and like kind of the id to fantasy's ego and that sort of stuff. It sounds like we need a horror expert to help us out though. Thank God we're joined.
That was one of the worst segues you've ever done.
I thought it was quite good.
Okay.
Luckily, we're joined by Stacey Abbott. Stacey, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you.
Stacey is an expert in horror. Would be to do an injustice to her CV. She's taught on this subject on a wide range of subjects on a wide range of film programs. Her research focuses on gothic and horror genres in film and television, with a particular interest in the vampire and zombie. So very helpful for today's discussion.
Yep.
And has worked on a range of topics dealing with horror and animation. She has a book she is working on, engaging precisely in this issue of the relationship between horror and animation, but she's published widely on this subject, including a recent edited collection on global TV horror co-edited with Lorna Jowett. Stacey will be, from January 2024, will be the Professor of Film of Northumbria University, but today she's here to talk about ParaNorman. So, Stacey, thanks for coming on the show, and what is it about ParaNorman that particularly kind of struck your fancy when we started chatting about you coming on the show?
Hi, thanks for having me on the podcast. And I think there are lots of really interesting children's-oriented or family-friendly horror films. But I think for me, ParaNorman, one of the reasons I was quite interested in it is because I think it's probably one of the most successful in terms of actually pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable in terms of scaring children. Like, I actually saw it and thought, this is actually quite scary. And I had some friends say, is this suitable for my children? And I was going, I don't have children, so I don't know. Yeah. But I do think it pushes the boundaries and walks a very careful line about in recognizing the pleasures of horror for kids. And actually taking us to that edge, and then, but not going too far, where it's suddenly where you think actually you've crossed the line, and the audience you may be targeting are not going to be able to see it or going to find it too scary. So I love that aspect of it, and I love the idea of them wanting to make a zombie film for kids. And I think it works really well as a zombie film. So those are kind of the things I was interested in, and why I first thought, no, I think it's a really successful film in terms of what it's trying to do.
So the category of children's horror. So first of all, okay, so what does that mean as a category? And I'm struck when you said recognizing, this is a film that recognizes the pleasure of horror for children. So what makes and Kat Lester, who's been a guest on our podcast, has written about horror films for children, and so in your view, what is a horror film for children? Is it about does it include children as protagonists? Which is not all. There are horror films that include children that are quite horrific, like
Sure.
The Exorcist, that children are doing things that are unusual. This film obviously chimes with a film like Monster House or Frankenweenie, and we can talk about that. It feels like it's doing something different. Is it just that it's scarier, but includes? In your mind, what is a horror film for children? And I mean, it's a horrible question to ask, but is there
It's usually my job, Chris.
This is a cycle of films. I guess what I'm really asking is this a subset of horror cinema, or is this a type of children's cinema?
I would say it's both.
Right.
I would say it's both. I think in terms of what is a horror film for children, I think you can take the argument that it's films with children protagonists confronting horror, and I know that's something Kat Lester has written extensively about and really well, that there is something about that it enacts a narrative where children can recognize themselves on screen, confronting horror and also negotiating and processing fears and processing threat. And I think that is it's one of the benefits of horror, and it's one of the pleasures of horror. It's challenging yourself to what scares you and confronting these things, and learning how to cope with fear and anxiety. It's in a kind of safe space, and that's what horror often does. And I think that works really well in children's horror. Now, I wouldn't say that all horror films for kids have to have children protagonists. And I think the other way of looking at it is ones that really focus on monsters, because monsters are often a way that you can, they often serve like as an allegory or as a kind of method of confronting fears. And for that, I don't think kids need children protagonists. I think anything with monsters and people dealing with those, confronting those, or sympathizing with, identifying with monsters, is also a way for kids to engage with horror. And kids are very clever about kind of recognizing themselves in the monsters, or recognizing the monsters as threats in different ways. So I don't think there's one way.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of the pleasure is that confrontation.
Yeah.
I mean, with my horror hat on and not my animation.
If only you were wearing an actual horror hat,
I
then
know.
this would be. Anyway.
It would be great.
Yeah.
But with my horror hat on, I would say that often with kids, and again, I'm not an expert in children and media, but I think that one of the things with kids is they also do want to challenge themselves to see things that are a bit older, that are aimed a bit older, and recognizing, and I say that from my own experience. I think most horror fans will talk about the fact that we all probably watch things that we're arguably a little too young for.
Yeah.
But that's part of the attraction. So I think good horror that is trying to be for kids needs to recognize that kids don't want it to be too tame. They want to see something that is challenging them, because that's part of the fun of it. And you don't want to feel like, oh, well, it's too safe.
Yeah.
Because, that's less fun. And particularly for the budding horror fan in children, which most of us started as.
Yeah. We'll come to ParaNorman specifically in a second, but just to stay on this for a second, it just feels like when we have these conversations, it's back to that point. I've cited this a few times. I think it's Ewan Kirkland that makes this point, but I'm sure other scholars do. Like, why don't we treat children in the same kind of cultural category as we might gender or race, or why is age more deterministic in that way? Because actually, we can have this conversation about any genre, right? What is a children's comedy film, right? But for some reason, horror, the stakes feel harder because our culture creates a vision of childhood in which horror doesn't seem to be allowed part of it. In the exact same way in which fantasy is the opposite effect, right? Fantasy seems to be so simpatico with children because we like to think of children as dreamers, thanks to the Victorians, basically. But we like to think of that works, that's fine, and therefore adults aren't allowed to enjoy fantasies. But horror is the other way around. And exactly what you were saying there, you could say the same about comedy, right? Comedy fans start watching comedies that are deemed not appropriate for them at younger ages because they want to test themselves. But there's just something, it's less about the films themselves and more about kind of our cultural understanding of what the space of childhood should be. Because actually children don't want anything because there's no such thing as children. There's just lots and lots of individual young people all wanting lots and lots of different things, right? You know, so in a way there's something political about sort of why not make a children's horror, even though that is something that's against the grain of kind of current practices. And I think this film kind of just does it and does it really well and smartly and demonstrates that, yeah, you can just do it. It's fine. Like, you know, we can all get over this. It's okay. It's fine. Your children aren't going to be corrupted by seeing a zombie. It's fine. Like, you know.
So my question is going to be, so what does the is part of that the animation? Like, this is the thing about animation, whether it exaggerates or dilutes. Does it? And I think so. When you were talking about the confrontation, children like to. I don't know that the horror does something for them. That we have children that are confronting, and it's interesting that a lot of like whether it's in Frankenweenie or this film, that these kids, they like horror and they like horror movies and they like to make horror movies and they like to talk about horror movies and they screen them for their family, and so they're already fans. I think that's interesting. If we've already talked about children and horror, what's the animation bit doing in this relationship? Is it amplifying? I don't know. What is the animation doing in this?
Yeah, I mean, I would say generally, I think animation can either amplify or dilute. And I think that's often, and I think what's interesting with how people receive horror, like children's horror, is that when it's animated, it's perceived to be safer because it's not real. So it will automatically get a slightly people will be less concerned about the certificate. People seem more comfortable because it's safe. What I find really interesting with horror animation, and ParaNorman I think does this really well, is that I think actually like animation can enhance the horror in really exciting ways, and particularly stop motion, which is inherently uncanny and seems to be really well suited to horror. So I think something like ParaNorman does this really well, where actually you start off in what seems like a very safe space. We're introduced to Norman, watching TV, watching an animated, well, what in our terms is an animated zombie film. In his world is just a zombie film. But he's watching a rather cheesy, schlocky horror film on TV, and it's safe. No one's concerned. His parents aren't concerned about him watching this. He's watching it with his grandmother. That she's a ghost, we don't initially know. But, you know, he's watching it in a safe space, and it is presented as being very safe. But as the film goes, you know, and you're confronted by horror, by whether it's the zombies or the witch or the adults and the human, you know, actually the animation, there's something wonderfully unsettling about these characters. So we see the zombies' bodies literally falling apart. We see, you know, the kids being chased by these kind of monstrous creatures, or what seemed to be initially monstrous creatures. And I think the animation really brings that home. There is something unsettling about them, something slightly abject. And then by the time, and we can spend more time, I don't want to leap to the ending, but I think by the time we get to the witch is this wonderfully unsettling, scary creature who is beautifully constructed through animation, all different types of elements of animation that's put together, which makes her wonderfully scary. That works so well. And so I think the animation does enhance the horror. Because we spend a lot of time trying to work out how, you know, what is she? How we can't even try to identify how she's made. It's not simple. In the way that the little TV zombie we see at the beginning is so obviously kind of clay, you know, it just looks really squishy and clayish like Play-Doh. And then we get to the end to something that's really sophisticated and unsettling. And I think it knows exactly the path it's taking us on to get to that horror moment.
Absolutely.
I mean, I have lots to say about, and lots of things I want to ask you and probe you about the animation.
Should we do the bread and butter for listeners and do the synopsis of this movie that we're about to talk about? Stacey, would you like the honours, or what is your synopsis of ParaNorman?
synopsis of ParaNorman.
Yeah. Yes, we only have an hour, so
Yeah, exactly. A lot happens.
We just cut around it, and
It is. It's a story of a young boy named Norman who lives in a small town that has a reputation for being kind of haunted by a witch's curse, which has become sort of a tourist attraction. But he himself is also someone who's marked out as being quite different because he can see ghosts, which makes him strange, makes him a freak, and no one really believes him. And then what happens is the film takes us on a journey as he discovers that ability is part of a birthright to become someone who will effectively tame the witch every year, that it's his responsibility to stop her from enacting the curse. And it follows him on that journey as he tries to make sense of what that responsibility is on the one night of this anniversary of the witch's curse.
Very good. I think that sounds about it. I've written down comedy from the perspective of the kid from The Sixth Sense, ? So, but yeah, and I think you described that opening very well, where you get the kind of, this lovely... Well, this supposedly lovely scene of him with his grandmother, which is a lovely scene, even when it's revealed, but it's playing with kind of what that sets up, and what you've described in the plot there is the film is very interested in playing with kind of different registers of, I guess horror, where horror actually lies, right? And I think it might be talking about this, making it as a kid's horror film. Often that means it's made by people who are horror fans, who are almost having to fight for their own identity, and so often they're outsiders, and watching horror and liking horror in these movies is an act of rebellion or an act against the status quo. But it reminded me, this town that it's set in, it reminded me, has anyone ever had the pleasure of actually going to Salem? On the east coast of America, and it reminded me of Salem, and I suspect it's meant to, because it's a very similar town, a historic town. And I remember going to Salem, and Salem is a wonderful example of a place that is spooky, but is spooky to conceal its horrific origins. And I think that's what this film is ultimately quite interested in, is the difference between spookiness or abjectness, physical abjectness, and true horror. Because what's mad about Salem is if you walk up and down the high street, it's got all these kind of ghost shops, don't they, and like ghost trains and spooky things, and it's like this tourist trap. But obviously the reason it's got this reputation is because of the very real horrific crimes against women, against a community, all of that, which you can, if you're really desperate to find out about, there's a small plaque in a park in the corner of the town that no one else is looking at, because they're all running up and down eating cotton candy made of skull caps and things like that, right? And this film has that kind of sense of there is a real horrific history lurking behind all this spookiness, if only you would search for it, right? So I thought, do you have any... the film uses horror and the tropes of horror to kind of make a statement about what truly is horrific and what isn't.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and it plays, and I think by using the horror fan as that main character, so Norman, who loves his zombies and loves his horror, it's about him being able to see beyond the tropes and the commercialism and the exploitation, to actually recognize that there is something truly monstrous that not only lies beneath the surface of the town that was. I mean, like Salem, I've been to Salem. Salem is a town that has commercialized that history, but also has actually buried it.
Yes.
There's nothing left of the original Salem, and it's really interesting the way you go there, and it's just they have literally just erased that and then exploited it, and you see the same thing in ParaNorman, this idea. They have erased this and commercialized in the most grotesque way, in the sense of the witch is the cliche. Even to the point in the school play, the little girl playing the witch says, "Why do we always have to depict the witch with the hook, with the nose and the warts, and is a hideous?" And it's playing with that. And I think it really knows that it's about this horrible history of the past, but the ways in which that past repeats in the present. So the ways in which Norman himself is ostracized because of his difference is our hint to what the horror is in the past. That it's about difference, about these people, kids, whomever, who don't fit in and don't conform, who challenge people's expectation or understanding of, and I'm going to, if you could see me, you could see my air quotes, normality. It's that they don't fit in, and they're therefore a threat. And it's that fear factor, that response to that threat, that actually reveals the real monsters of the films, which are, not the supernatural monsters. And I think that's what's really what the film negotiates in a really clever way, and works really well.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah.
So as you said, the film begins where, and it's the same with kind of Frankenweenie. I think that there's a lot of comparisons between these two films in terms of the young horror film fan and outsiderdom, and so I had a question about kind of the specifics of stop motion, because there are plenty of horror films, mainstream computer animated horror films. So the Hotel Transylvania series is probably a good example, but I remembered the Monster Family.
Sure. Are these horror films, though?
Right. So they are described as computer animated monster comedy films, and which is...
That's fairer, I think.
Yes. But it feels like these films... I think that the computer animatedness of it lends itself to that kind of identity. Okay. Whereas the stop motion, and I don't know whether it is just the fact that stop motion is uncanny, or there's obviously more. There's more to it. There's more to it, because stop motion is uncanny. The objects exist in the real world. It's only through the special. Right. Okay. And so it makes it perfect fodder for horror. But is there more than that with regards to what stop motion is doing? Because a lot of these films, Frankenweenie's the same. They're interested in different. So in Frankenweenie, he's making terrible stop motion films that are very different to the stop motion movements of characters in the. So I don't know. There's something around. It's more than just the stop motionness, or is there something intrinsic about the stop motion beyond the fact that they are objects and it's uncanny that really does lend itself to horror in a way that smooth, pristine computer graphics making quite horrific images in Monster Family and decapitations and Hotel Transylvania, it's played for laughs, but it's a bit technologically deterministic. But I just feel that why are so many stop motion films in the horror genre? And is it whether it's Frankenweenie or Coraline to some extent, ParaNorman, Corpse Bride, why is there such?
It's a really good question. I'm spending a lot of time thinking about that at the moment. And one of the things I would say is that horror is drawn to materiality.
Yes.
There's something very physical about horror. I mean, it's for the same reason, going back to the comment about CGI, is that particularly when CGI effects first started being introduced, they work really well in science fiction. And in horror, we all just go, it doesn't work because it feels intangible. And you just don't feel, it just doesn't feel like it has effect. That's obviously changed a lot, but I still think that there's something about horror that is really drawn to that materiality, that physicality, that feeling, and I think the stop motion works that way. That it's allowed to be a little more grounded in a real space, grounded in its setting and its environment, and if you look at the behind the scenes on ParaNorman and Frankenweenie and all these films, they are really kind of beautifully constructed sets. The thought of lighting, now which is really, you feel the light on these characters, you feel that kind of atmosphere that's being constructed, and I think all of that kind of surrounding material and the very the materiality of the actual characters, the zombies, the witch, really does ground them in something that feels quite tangible.
Yeah.
And I think tangibility is a big part of horror, that we respond more to things that feel physical.
Yeah.
Even whether they're intended to be that or not. I was just for something else writing about Svankmeyer's Lightness, Dark Lightness, is that the order? Or Dark Light? Yeah, Lightness, Dark Lightness, which is all about clay. And it's about art and creation. But whenever I've shown it to my students, because this is a film which basically has a small house and bits of body parts made of clay arrive in the house and gradually, put themselves together into a human body. And the squishiness of the clay and the physicality of these body parts always respond in this kind of very vocal kind of response from my students. And that my students, that sometimes laughter, some of it's very funny, but also some of it is making kind of noises of disgust, like it's sort of disgusting. And I think there's something about the physicality that lends itself to how we respond to the affect.
Yeah, but sound though, because computer animation doesn't, well, digital images don't make a sound, but also the stop motion objects don't make a sound because of the way that the labour works, and yet there is something that the sound effects of Sankmeier films are striking. The materiality of things rubbing together, even though it's no more or no less artificial because of the way that it's made. Yeah. They aren't going to rub like that because they'd have to rub 24 frames a second. And that's just not going to work. Yeah. And yet there's something about stop motion makes a noise somehow.
Yeah. Riffing on this more, is there something about its kind of the pro-filmicness of stop motion that, I mean, this is a bit too essentialist and a bit too cute, but if you think of, kind of proto-horror stories of certainly the last kind of 200 years, right? They're often about, the aliveness of death or the deathness of being alive or the kind of the uncanniness of that. Vampires, zombies, things like that. There is something zombie-like about animating an object that isn't true of a drawing. It's in a different register. Yeah. In a way, they are zombies.
Absolutely.
We're talking about affect at the moment, and I wondered, I don't know if this is going to send us down too much of a quagmire, but I'm interested in relation to that and the slightly more kind of cerebral interpretive response that this film can offer, and certainly in certain interviews they have invited that kind of response. I suspect from a slightly more adult audience, but again, let's not discount what children can and can't do, maybe. And this idea of the zombie as a figure of metaphor, and often a figure of metaphor for either memory or history or kind of the underbelly of society, all these kind of things, and how the film uses that. And I guess to not ask 80 questions at once, I'll start by asking sort of what you think the function of the metaphorical function of zombies is in this movie, given that there's usually a metaphorical function for zombies in horror history, right? If we get, the classic one is like the Romero movies, right? Everyone sort of cites this as all of Romero's movies can theoretically be interpreted as the zombies represent something. So what's it, Night of the Living Dead? It's kind of race, and in I'm going to get my Living Deads mixed up now. Is it Day of the Dead, the next one, and that's consumerism, and so on and so on and so on. So what are the zombies in this film? What are they representing, or do they? Or do
no,
they
I think they do, and I think that is a fair way. I think the film, they're very knowing of their zombie lore and their zombie those traditions of allegory. And I would say that there are a number of things they do. I think on one hand, zombies do stand in for adults. There's a great line where they say, "It's the zombies," and they just pause. And then no, it's grown-ups. Even worse. So I think they are, from the point of view of these children and these slightly outsider children, these adults, the kind of it's not parents, it's the grown-up world and all the prejudices that they represent. And I think in a film that fundamentally comes down to being about persecution and this narrative of the witch's curse being about persecution, going back to the comment made about Salem, the zombies become initially, or revealed to finally be, the kind of the remnants of those people who persecuted the innocent. So I think that's a big part of it. But I think there's also a sense that there's also something rather sad about the zombies, because they also represent, because they're eventually revealed to be not a threat. That as much as that they are themselves cursed. So they're also a kind of thing, an allegory for people who have done wrong and are trying to now kind of escape that legacy for themselves. So there really is a sense where they represent kind of the sad, or the, I want to say pathetic, is that too mean to the zombies? Sort of pathetic legacy of people who have judged wrongly and have now been reduced down to this kind of undead body, like that they have themselves become the monsters.
Okay, yeah.
And I think it's that idea of revealing them to be the monsters that they are. They are kind of showing their inner monster when they finally become these abject bodies.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a key bit. But I like the fact that the zombies themselves are finally shown to be not the threat and fundamentally kind of sad and pathetic, that they are just, they need his help. They need Norman's help.
So to riff on that, I've got a few thoughts on this, but I guess where I'm coming at this is that I often talk about metaphor, and I've got quite a sort of ambivalent relationship with metaphor as a theorist of fantasy, because quite often it's used in. I wonder if you share this concern or not. It's often used by scholarship, or indeed just in the reception, the sort of immediate critical reception, to justify its it's not just some goblins and some fairies running around in the woods. It's actually all about something else. Yeah. It's that kind of Peter Jackson, when he got the Lord of the Rings stage, he said, "Thank you for looking past all the hobbits and the trolls and things." Yeah. And I sort of think that's it, right? It's this idea. I don't like the idea of looking past all these things. I quite like all those things. So why can't I just look at them? Thanks. So I guess I'm interested in that, and whether this desire to allegorize the zombie takes us away from some of the stuff we were just talking about in terms of its just affective quality, which might be it's certainly where the genre is doing whatever it does at its most genre-ness. Yeah. And then I'm also interested in the way the film then plays with those things in the film itself, right? And that actually Norman has to do, in Night of the Living Dead, the characters don't go, "Oh my God, it's about race," about like 2/3 before the end, right? And solve the problem, because they work out actually, if they just, I don't know, join the progressives and vote a better civil rights agenda, then the zombie apocalypse will end. But the characters in this do that. So I wonder what distinction that makes to kind of some of this stuff. I don't know. I know that's like 8 things, but pick one of them and we'll see where we go.
No, I mean, just to go back to the issue of allegory, I mean, I do agree. I mean, I don't mind allegory, but I think we have to not see it as limiting of what's going on. I think sometimes it is a shade of what we're watching. It's one layer of what we're watching, and sometimes it's intended. Sometimes it is that clever way of justifying and appeasing the critics, again, particularly for malign genres where people say, well, why would you want to watch zombies? Yeah. Well, because it's about consumerism. Yeah. I completely agree that it's a get out of jail free card to say, here, we can do this.
And I guess with this film, why would you want to make kids watch zombies? Well, don't worry, they're metaphors to help
or more than that, don't worry, they're animated. All animation is a metaphor. Well, animation studies say all animation is a metaphor because it has to be commenting on something. It's always rhetorical, as you've heard me say many times. So it's all metaphor. It's all symbolic. It's all in some ways allegorical, because it's the comment on the thing or the interpretation of the thing, never the thing itself. And so I wonder, this is the thing about whether the animation's adding a bit to this safeness to it. But anyway, sorry, I was
no. I think these are all good points. I mean, and I think having said that, I think it is an excuse. It is often that get out of jail free card. But I also think that it's part of the long history of horror, that horror and monsters often are, because in a way they serve, if not a kind of cult, like an individual function, that often they are part of how we negotiate kind of how we see the world, is how we feel ourselves to be monsters or see other things as monsters. So I think I don't really have a problem with that. But it's limiting to only look at it that way and say, actually, there's a lot going on with these intersections between the pleasures of zombies or other monsters and the intellectual thinking about it. And I think kids are smart. Like with a film like ParaNorman, I think kids are smart enough to get it on both levels. I think they can see what it's doing. And Frankenweenie is a similar one, where it's all dealing about death and confronting children with death. And actually, one of the things I find interesting of both this film of ParaNorman and Frankenweenie is the ways in which these stories are about confronting children with the reality of death and grief, and using the fantastical narrative and the horror to actually talk about things that we're not supposed to talk to young kids about, which is that people die and that we're gonna die. And I think that's one thing. Definitely, it's an obvious narrative of Frankenweenie with young Victor bringing his dog back to life.
Yeah.
But I think ParaNorman is dealing with it in an even more sophisticated way because, it becomes the reality that Norman lives with, which is that he's surrounded by ghosts, and he's surrounded by and ghosts that tell you exactly how they died. Like that opening sequence when he walks down the street and you see the world from his perspective. They're not just ghosts; they're ghosts who are like hanging from a tree because they got caught in a tree from a parachute, I think, in that, or the gangster who was clearly killed the mobster who was killed in the river with cement shoes, and there's something about them that's really confronting people with how they died. And so I think that's something where it's using that allegory to not just explain it in a way that makes it safe, but actually to say, we're talking about something that that traditionally we're not supposed to talk about with kids in this way, or expect our kids' movies to be talking about. And I think coming back to the main narrative around the witch, that's the real power of the narrative around the witch, is not just that she's a witch, but it's the fact that is how she died. And then who it is, and when it's revealed who she is, that's a really powerful moment to say, this is the worst case scenario. This is why the real monsters are not the witch. It's the people behind the zombies who basically hung the witch.
A lot of these I say these kinds of movies, the Frankenweenie, Coraline, Paranormal Cause, there's always those two. There's always the adults, and then there's always something else. And a lot of these films do this, where and I don't know why, but I find it often it's refreshing that the character, certainly in Paranorman, it doesn't begin with him learning to acquire this power. He's just kind of got it, and we just move on with so this idea that we shouldn't talk about it. Or the animated horror or children's horror is used to talk about things that we shouldn't really talk about. It's refreshing that the children are already implicated in these stories anyway. Another parallel I'd say is something like Coco, which is also about death and seeing and people and figuring out how people die, but it feels different because it's CGI. Anyway, so I think the two-tier villains. There's always adults are the villains, but there's always something else, and I liked how that film how this film played with that. And kind of really pushed it. I felt like it really pushes that's what makes it so successful. Yeah. So I thought it was,
But I'm playing with a paradox that I think
classic Sergeant.
That's what's on the t-shirt. Which is that I don't know. I think there's something about the ending of this movie which seems to be caught up in a lot of what we're saying, in that because it sort of explains the metaphor. I haven't got a problem with that, and by explaining them, it kind of provides an affirmative route to restoration, and they're not left as monsters. There's no monsters left at the end of the movie.
Only the adults.
Only the adults, and even then, there's been a level of reconciliation where the adults are no longer monstrous because of all these sort of things. Whilst I think that's very rich narratively and thematically, and I think, as a child, I think I would respond very well to all the kind of ideas, and as an adult, I do. I wonder if what's lost there is that it ceases to be a horror movie by the end of the movie, and the final sort of third of the movie isn't as it's not affecting as a horror movie anymore. Yeah. So it's almost like the end of Waltz with Bashir, which is we've talked about a lot of times now on this podcast, where it has to suddenly go, well, if we're going to do this properly, we have to turn into live action. It's almost like this film goes, we've got this far being a horror movie, but to get us out of this, we're going to have to sort of shed we can't have the slasher still be in the bath at the end, right? And that seems paradoxical to me in terms of we've made this kid's horror movie, but part of what we've done here is kind of explain its horror away, and therefore it's no longer there's nothing to be scared of at the end of the movie, and most horrors don't do that. I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's really, really interesting. And I think you're right. I mean, I'm just kind of working it through in my
Yeah.
head.
Oh, he does
because-
this all the time.
Yeah,
It's
because
like
it's a really interesting idea because you're right. Tradition, particularly modern horror, doesn't reconcile. In fact, that's one of the kind of defining features of modern horror. Probably not. I don't like to say first, but it's definitely the Night of the Living Dead idea that you end it where the you can't contain the monster. You can't contain it. It's just out there. And that is definitely an element of what is kind of pleasurable or whatever, because the monster is bigger than our ability to control it. I think so. I think you're right. This one doesn't do that, but there's some, and one could argue that it is because, and again, it goes back to it's because it's aimed at kids, that it has to kind of reassert a sense of safeness at the end.
Yeah, it's not just that it doesn't end with a restoration. A lot of horror films will do that, but it kind of what's the uncanny invasion into a horror movie is that there's an evil in the world, right? And whether the evil gets vanquished, fine, but there's still a world in which evil is possible at the end of most horror movies. In this, it almost sort of suggests these things that you thought were monsters, witches, things like that, they're not. Which there's a progressive element to that message and things like that. But at the same time, it means that there's no monsters left. There actually aren't any monsters in this movie.
No, absolutely.
In the way there are in Night of the Living Dead.
Yes. Yeah. But I think that in a way the function it's doing is to flip our understanding of what monsters means. Yeah. And I think and I think that's where the idea of, because Aggie is a monster at the end, like up until he convinces her to give up her hate. She is terrifying and she is monstrous. She's physically monstrous. Going back to the animation really presents her as being other. But he eventually is able to break through to her to understand that what the real monsters hate. So it is nicely contained. I would argue, I suppose when I come away, I feel like the film is saying, yes, there are no monsters anymore in this town. They've reconciled this. But I feel like because of the theme of going back to the themes, I think because of the nature of what they're saying about what is monstrous, which is prejudice, lack of understanding, lack of empathy, fear, well, that's not gone away, I think. So I don't feel like they're saying the world is now not fearful of these things. And that's the real monster. And so I think for me, I still come away feeling like, well, there are monsters in the world. This town has sorted it. But I feel like it's not saying, well, that's all sorted for the rest of the world. Like, I think, yes, we're sorted it here. And I think that story is saying, but the real monster is hate and fear itself.
And I guess this links back to what it's a children's horror movie, and so there's that kind of act of reclaiming that space. It reminds me, I don't actually know this firsthand, but I know Mark Kermode, the film critic, a big horror fan, tells this anecdote a lot. Is it John Carpenter who went to see the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and says, I went and watched it on repeat on a double bill, and then I went home and slept like a child because it pacified my soul. And it's this idea that the true horror in life is not. The horror fans aren't the thing you need to worry about. Yeah. They've worked through their problems by enjoying their entertainment. It's the repressed. It's the monster, the big monster movies, the slasher movies that you're all terrified about showing your children. Yeah. That ain't the problem. It's the everyday monstrosity that they will encounter because they live a life. But actually, the real horrible monstrosity that we won't let them encounter. It's back to the Salem analogy. The spooky high street is horrific only because it hides the true horror that we really should be confronting.
Absolutely. And I think that's where, and even at the end, because one of the sort of microcosm ways in which it explores those kind of fears is through Norman's relationship with his father. And his father is in complete denial about anything to do with the supernatural. Doesn't believe him when he says he sees ghosts. Just complete denial. And, it comes round to the end where the father has recognized and finally accepts this and walks into the room and makes a comment, is your grandmother here? Tell her I said hi. I can't remember what he says, but, it's a nice moment. He's still clearly uncomfortable. Like, he's still not quite there. So it's not saying, he's still, but he's trying.
Yeah.
So there's an attempt. he isn't able to see her, but he recognizes it and he tries. But he's kind of uncomfortable. He's uncomfortable. He's visibly uncomfortable. So I think that it's those little things which say that actually, yeah, there is something, these are the things we need to watch out for. And these are the things that are where the real danger lurks.
I mean, maybe this goes back to the sort of two-tier. There's the parents and then there's the other. It seems to me that in a lot of these movies that there's a kind of horror has just become a series of embodiments for children. First of all, it's just they're sort of the villain is the parents, and there's always a sister that they don't get on with, and then the sister's jock boyfriend. Or Monster House does this very well. But that's a sort of they're unhappy with their home life, because they're outside or they get bullied at school. We know the drill. Then that gets transferred onto an actual monster that kind of takes them away a little bit from the previous problem, and then it's something else. And so the children's horror seems to kind of work with this series of transference where it's the fear of the adults are the villains, and then it's the real monster, and then after the film it'll probably be something else, and then it'll be something else after that, and the monster is just one of a series of things that the child will have to encounter. And what you said, the real horror is the feelings that undergird all of those different connections, or all of those encounters with these different kinds of things, fear about something. So that kind of two-tier. There's always a two-tier. They always don't get on with their family, and that's really important. And the dads are a bit alienated, and that's and they do a bit of reconciliation, but it's only through working through their relationship to a monster that is then reconciled, and that primes them for the next time they encounter a monster, whatever that looks like, or something like that.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I was struck watching it. I almost thought the film was made a few years later than it was when I was watching it, because I was thinking, you talk a lot on the podcast about kind of Trump and nicety and the importance of nicety. And this felt like a kind of a horror movie made in the era. I mean, it's a bit before it, right? But it's certainly claiming that sense that of
nice call
of the sort of political importance of self-care, I guess, and things like that. It's a movie with a very generous spirit to it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think it is about you're right, self-care. It is about kind of coming to terms with who you are. In terms of your own difference, but also where you sit within those family dynamics and that community dynamics. And just going back to kind of the way it feels almost kind of Trump era, it does feel like it's a film that's, it's one of those films that's setting up a commentary on society that kind of we should have seen sooner than we did, and it's that thing of it was always bubbling there. So those depictions of the town, I think are really telling of that kind of culture that said, actually, these people were there, this idea, these tensions of people's resistance to difference, people's, just political landscape was all there. So I think some of the mob scenes, which is a kind of classic horror trope. I mean, they were right out of Frankenstein, this mob, but they are a very 21st century mob. Down to with lots of jokes about the police officer saying, don't shoot the civilians. That's the police officer. Our job to do that. And people coming out with weddings, with weapons, and there's that and that power of the mob, and the zombies are the ones who just run away. Which is again, Night of the Living Dead does that with the militia, who are the ones who kill the zombies, and they're worse than the zombies, and it's nodding back to that. So I think it's very much in that landscape of 21st century culture, of just the ways in which society is is dysfunctional, and that's where the horror lies.
It's almost a film. To me, it's a sort of the trauma of bullying. I've written down is kind of what it's really that kind of the reciprocal, repetitive, undead quality of kind of that, right? Because it's a very It's quite a simple, everyday trauma that lies at the heart of the air quotes time, the witch of the movie, right? Yeah. That creates her identity, which creates the identity of the zombies, which creates the identity of this town, which creates Norman, which creates, all this kind of layers upon layers of cruelty, I guess, is actually exactly what Chris is saying, actually, yes. So that struck me. It's like, actually, this is sort of the way it uses the horror tropes to kind of pull back those layers, and kind of you can see it almost like a fractal from Norman straight to her. It actually reminded me quite a lot of Moana, the ending of Moana with where the volcano the volcano monster becomes actually just sort of like another
the good witch,
another injured woman, and Moana, and looks a lot like Moana, right? Eventually, like there's something to that.
The injured. I was thinking of, like, that's how Monster House, because that's the whole premise of Monster House, is that we've done on the podcast, that it's this. It's really about the wronged woman, which is also what Corpse Bride's about. And so, I don't know, there's some interesting... I don't mean to do a disservice to the film by networking it together, but it does seem that it was released in 2012, and there's, I think, which is either the same year or the year before. The same year as Frankenweenie?
It is the same year.
Yeah, same year as Frankenweenie. It was just interesting that these two films sort of spring up in interesting ways.
There was an interesting... Maybe it's just all moved on to Netflix, and I just don't notice it anymore. But like, there seemed to be an interesting era of these kind of... these horror kids animations that they were quite ubiquitous for a while, and then they don't seem to be made in quite the same...
But this is what I mean about why. It's not just that stop motion... I mean, it is that stop motion is uncanny, like, of course it is.
Yes.
But why all of a sudden all of these films doing this kind of work... I don't know.
Yeah, we've known that for a while. Why now?
Exactly.
Svangmar
told us. Well, in fact, Starovich in the 1910s, 20s, we know that stop motion's uncanny. So I don't need a film 80 years later to go, by the way, it's really creepy because stuff like moves and is undead. I know that.
So is that right? Is that just the wrong assessment, that there was like this wave of these movies?
Definitely the wave of... I mean, and I would go beyond just... stop motion, because I can't remember exactly the year of Monster House, but it's not that far off. And you've got Hotel Transylvania, which again is also 2012, so it's the same year as Frankenweenie.
What was going on in 2012?
And absolutely. And I think there's just something, and obviously, the cynical head will say, it's obviously cycles of, we see this in every kind of filmmaking, that you suddenly get these cycles because, if something does well and there's something that came out slightly earlier that showed the popularity. I think, obviously, and you're the better expert than me on the animation, but, I think something like Nightmare Before Christmas opened the door to saying, feature-length stop motion was something that was practical and achievable in ways. It set up a lot of ideas, and you have Coraline and Corpse Bride. I think there is a kind of a wave of recognizing the potential of doing these feature-length films and horror. I would also go, then it becomes about the filmmakers making it, they're all little Normans who are going, but we're really horror fans and we want to be able to make this. So I think there's also those cycles, because even, Arbin makes the Curse of the Were-Rabbit, which is playing with horror tropes. And I think it's just this recognition that there is this potential, this idea. It's not new, but it's now we're in a space where we have the tools to make these longer films, remake these ideas, and tie in with kind of the rising popularity of horror in the 21st century, which, in the same period, horror is becoming more mainstream as a genre. I mean, it is becoming, and it is becoming really popular beyond the horror fans. So you're having really big global successes of found footage horror. You have Blair Witch in '99. You've got Paranormal Activity. There's this whole there's just this wave of horror that we're still in, where it's just horror starts moving to television in the same period, where suddenly we're seeing lots of horror. So I think there's that increasing sense the horror is a very popular and malleable genre to work with across media.
Zombies too, right? I'd sort of forgotten that there was that period where there was 10 zombie movies a year, right?
Yeah.
This is like, and across different genres, right? This is I don't know, I can't place it exactly chronologically, but this is also the Shaun of the Dead and Zombieland and all these different
Absolutely.
kind of... Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. And on television, you have, in 2010, you have The Walking Dead comes on the air. And, just it is just this explosive period. And I think, and again, with my TV horror hat on, because I have yet another hat.
I was going to say, this is...
There's something about animation as this area that often mainstream critics might say, well, isn't a place for horror.
Mm-hmm.
People said the same thing about TV, but this, people say, for the longest time, people would say, well, you can't really do horror on television. But I think in this period of the 21st, suddenly all bets are off, and everyone's saying, well, actually, horror is really, really, well, cynically lucrative, but also creative and lots of potential. And we can think about horror in different ways. It doesn't have to, if you're on television, you've got restrictions on what you can show, which isn't the case now anyways. But, there are ways of doing horror and being quite bold and graphic on television that still gets around all the censor issues. And I just think that there's this moment that suddenly people are just seeing potential to think of horror in very different ways across different media.
We're starting to run out of time, so I guess there bits of the movie which went very quickly. So there are bits of the movie. There's so much we could have said, but is there anything we really do need to say before we've?
Well, all I will say is that we've talked about it as a stop motion film, but obviously it uses digital effects and that sort of hybridity. So I'm going to I'll garble this a little bit, but Eilishwood has written about, and I think I might have mentioned this when we did it, but Aardman in the chapter called Aardman in an Entanglement with CGI is about pirates and adventure with scientists, about what it means for the tactility of handmade animation to come into a kind of conflict with what she calls the digital made, the handmade and the digital made. And she says that often that combination is either like kind of erased completely in promotional material, or it's made a real virtue of. And in Aardman's case, you don't want to take Aardman away from the handmade, so you emphasise that. And so she talks about kind of these stop motion traditions, whether or not they work, how they work with digital interventions. Does digital like the hiding, the veiling processes, and then she says how VFX creates and activates a hybrid digital physical space. And so I just thought it was interesting that we've sort of talked about it as a stop motion film, when actually it uses some interesting digital effects. And sometimes when animation is involved, whether it's Who Framed Roger Rabbit, where it's Buzz versus Woody, like when animation's involved, it often seems easy to be like, or to read it symbolically. So at the end where he's facing off against this sort of digitized, I was thinking, is it just new way? It's not the old versus new, like that's too rubbish and bargain basement. But I don't know, it just felt interesting that there was stop motion tells some of the story, but not all of it because it's digital. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on its digital bits, or whether you thought it used it effectively, or were there key moments. Often the digital is used where you can't do it in stop motion, so we need to do it in. So really, I just wanted to pick your brains.
Yeah, I mean, I find the use. This is for me one of the films I think is probably one of the more effective uses of integrating digital and and stop motion, because, and actually interesting that watching a lot of the behind the scenes material that they talk more about that than they do in other ones, where they do kind of conceal the fact that yes, we of course use digital to erase things and we're using digital effects. They talk quite upfront about the benefits and seeing this is quite hybrid. And I think what I like about The Witch at the end is the way that she is very much this hybrid of the stop motion and the digital, that there are things, and the fact that I spend a lot of time trying to work out how did they do that, because it feels quite tangible, but and some of it doesn't. So I think there's some really interesting kind of hybridity that I think really works for this explosive monster moment. But so I think there's something, so I'm not sure if I would read, it being like at the end, it's the big monster.
Yeah, no.
The digital, because I actually, what I think, for me, it is that she becomes this real complex hybrid. That there is something really like she is both physically bound. She has a body. She is a puppet, but she is also extends way beyond that. And I really like that she almost explodes on screen.
Yeah.
Like all that, and it's, it's again going back to allegory, right? It's rage and she's exploding, but there's just visually, it's just, I find it really dynamic and really quite exciting to watch those sequences because she just seems so much more than digital or stop motion. It's like she just pulls everything together and is a bit of everything.
Yeah,
which I really like.
Well, it seems like those stop motion films lend them. You talked about the extra texture behind the scenes stuff. It seems like the computer animated film special features on DVDs are sort of a bit terrible. Yeah. They don't really tell me. Whereas, and I wonder whether this is a Leica thing, which we haven't really kind of talked about, whether or not they really do embrace. There's so many videos of them animating, like that's almost part of it, that they show the green screen and blue, so they're not afraid. And they're not afraid to declare that kind of technology, and so I find that kind of quite refreshing when a lot of it is, no, we still use handmade, so don't worry, we're not going to, this is the Aardman thing, but it feels like Leica are really embracing the mixed media to really good effect.
Yes, absolutely. And you're right, I think they're really upfront, and I think it's part of their kind of image as a studio is to say like this is what we do, this is what we create, but they always include both in the extra features but also over the credits of the films those little moments where you get to see in kind of stop motion the creation of something. So at the end of ParaNorman you actually see the creation of Norman from armature through to a little walking Norman, and I really like that's actually part of the text. Yeah. And you're right, and I think that's just that they are, and I think there's a recognition that a part of a pleasure to stop motion for audiences is the how they made it. That is part of the pleasure, and it's part of things when people are enjoying. They enjoy the physicality of it, but also just the magic of filmmaking. Because it does feel quite magical. Whereas I think with digital, and I think we just expect digital to look spectacular. You mentioned Coco earlier. It's one of my favorites. It looks stunning, and I kind of expect that digital animated experience. I expect it to look like that, and it's wonderful. But I'm more likely to bask in the glow of Coco and just enjoy the spectacle. Whereas there is something like you want to unpack ParaNorman to think about how did they do that. And I spend a lot of time like going back and forth over a sequence of going, is that digital or the ghost? How did they do that? The ghosts, because they're puppets, but they're clearly there's a digital effect or visual effects to kind of make them look more spectral. And there's something about it sort of invites, I think, that.
Yeah, no, I think that the kind of almost the medium specificity of stop motion. It does position you in a particular kind of viewing experience, and it does. You want to know. I said I wouldn't say the word aura, but I'm going to say the word aura, and this is specifically for one listener in particular. Like the medium specificity is doing some work. I know that you have your own version of aura.
No, I was more saying for the listener's benefit, no one knew that you were going to say aura until that moment. For the listener's benefit, Chris said just before we started going, I'm trying not to use the word aura today, and now he's going to use the word aura.
But no, that kind of medium specificity does position us to think about labour in really interesting ways, and the one wants to lean into stop motion and know more and unpack in a way that perhaps CGI, I don't, it's often something else.
I was struck listening to a couple of behind the scenes features, and also I've been doing a lot of reading around stop motion and interviews with stop motion animators, and the fact that a number of them talk about the physical pain of stop motion animation, like because you are physically having to work around sets and talk about back problems, and there's something about just the sense of the language is around just the effort, not just the love and the handmadeness, but also like this is a very painful, it's difficult, it's long hours, it's exhausting, it forces you to twist your own body in unusual ways just to kind of work in these circumstances, and I find that really interesting, and you don't hear, and I'm sure digital animators or hand-drawn animators spend a lot of long hours and have back pain and have a lot of pain, but we don't hear people talking about it in the same way, or at least I haven't come across it in the same way that you hear with stop motions where they're talking about it. This is really physically demanding.
Anyway.
Well, yes, we could riff more, but perhaps we shan't. So Stacey, these thoughts on ParaNorman are part of a gestating project on animation and horror more broadly. we're at the beginning stages of the project, are we? So we won't expect it out just yet. But if listeners are listening in a few years' time, it might be out indeed. So just talk to us a little bit about what you what you're thinking and where it is at the moment.
Yeah. So the aim of the book, it's on horror animation, and in part it's tying with a lot of the ideas we've been talking about here, is those synergies between horror and animation as a medium, and as a medium specificity to think about how horror is constructed, but also how animation perhaps changes our understanding of horror, and how horror changes our reception of animation, just about what that dialogue is. But the aim is rather ambitious. So it's looking at short films alongside features, it's looking at multiple modes of animation, and really trying to think of, and just different traditions of animation. So, looking at that surrealist tradition and thinking about that approach, but then also the more gore effects or that you get with people like Lee Hardcastle and Robert Morgan, who do a lot of these much more graphic horror animation. So I'm really interested in kind of basically revealing that hidden narrative of horror animation, that there's a vast amount out there. And it's one of those interesting projects that every time I talk to people about doing this, and when I say I'm writing a book on horror animation, they look at me with this blankness, like, and what is there? And then within a couple of minutes, they start coming up with titles. And I kind of go, it's kind of to say, actually, there is a long history of horror animation, or intersections between the two that I want to kind of expose, play with, kind of think about. And that's kind of the big project.
Very exciting. Yeah. Looking forward
Get
to
it on your reading list.
to the end result. So we'll have to have Becky on to talk about it then. But
Thank you.
For now, Stacey, thanks so much for coming on and talking about ParaNorman.
Thank you very much.
Where can you find us? You can find us at Fan
What do you
You
mean
can find
where?
us in the murky past and our zombie-like presence on fantasy-animation.org, where we have our undead blog and podcast, which you can access the archive of. You can also use that handle FANANIM Research, FANANIM Research, on all our social media handles to talk to us there. You can also use the same way at gmail.com to email us with future footnote suggestions.
Yes.
Otherwise, that's been us for another episode, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.